Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thanks so much for being here today. Today's video is going to be a discussion on the best books I read for grad school. So for those of you who don't know, which it would honestly be shocking at this point because I genuinely don't shut my mouth about it, but I got my master's degree at the end of 2022, and it was a culmination of taking a lot of classes, writing a lot of papers, giving a lot of presentations, and also taking this really big final exam where I had to read 50 pieces of literature, write about them, and then get examined on them. I did like an oral examination where I was asked a bunch of questions about this literature and I had to answer. So I have spent a lot of time with these books, and some of the books on this list are completely because I just love the story or I loved the characters. In other cases, it's just because I think the writing is so beautifully done. And then of course, there are a few sentimental favorites that I just spent a lot of time with. So even if like the stories maybe isn't my favorite, I still spent so much time with the book that it had to be mentioned in this video, and it really impacted my studying and like who I am as a student and as a now graduate. So anyway, I've got a little stack over here. I tried to really just pick like my absolute favorites and the books that I spent the most time with. So that's what we're gonna talk about. Before we get into the actual video, I wanted to do a Q&A sometime soon, but I don't have an Instagram anymore, so I have like no place to collect questions. So if you would like to ask me a question for a future Q&A, please leave a question down below and I will try to answer it. But it can be about anything. It can be about school, it could be about reading, it could be about the wedding, it could be about my dogs. That's what I've got. I feel like I don't really have anything else to offer, but I thought it'd be fun to do a Q&A. No pressure, but if you wanted to, you could leave a question. All right, let's get into the books. Okay, so the first book on this list is both a sentimental favorite and also just a literary favorite, one that I studied a lot and one that impacted future research throughout my graduate student career, and that is Don Quixote. This is a sentimental favorite because it was my grandma's favorite book, and she was a literature professor, and so I was very intimidated by this book, but when I ended up loving it, I felt this like connection with my grandma. Although she's no longer here, it was just like, hey, I'm your granddaughter that's like carrying on this love of Don Quixote, and it was just sentimental and sweet. But it's also just incredibly funny, really well done, and it really set up a lot of future interest, research, and writing that I did throughout my program, because Don Quixote is the namesake for the quixotic character. So a quixotic character is basically, in Don Quixote, we have a main character, Don Quixote, who is obsessed with chivalric romances. And so because he reads so many chivalric romances, he convinces himself that he is a knight living in one of these romances that he's obsessed with. And so he ends up maybe, yes, fictitiously making up things that are not actually happening, but he ends up living a knightly life because of how much literature has influenced him. So from there, we have other characters who are quixotic through many, many other pieces of literature. An example of this is actually with a book that I read at the end of last year, which is My Heart is a Chainsaw. In that book, we have a main character who is obsessed with slasher films, and so she convinces herself that she is in a slasher film. And so the story then, like, it's all about like following tropes and acting accordingly and doing what the final girl does in slasher films. And so the book itself is a slasher, and our main character, who is obsessed with slashers, is living in a slasher. So anyway, that's just one example of a quixotic character, but I feel like this book really set me up for a lot of really fun studying, and I wrote a whole paper that talked about this book and Ready Player One and quixotism that comes up in both, and it was just really fun. So I loved this one. All right, another book that I studied that I absolutely loved was Dracula. I annotated the shit out of this book. I was a TA for this class, so I hadn't actually read it, but I led a whole discussion on Lucy and Mina, the two main women in this book, and it was so fun, and I had so much fun annotating this book, and just the conversations that the students were having were like just so fun, right? Like, I learned so much from them, and half the time I felt like they were far smarter than me, but this book was just such a ride. It obviously had been on my radar way before I took the class, but I kept talking myself out of reading it because it's, first of all, super long, and second of all, it's all told in the epistolary format, so it's all told through letters and journal entries, and I remember opening it years ago and being like, no, no, I'm not doing that. Like, thank you, but I'm not reading a book of letters. I want to read about a vampire. I don't want to read someone's journal, right? So admittedly, I put it off for a very long time, and then I had to read it for school, and it was an absolute blast, and just very fun. I mean, the whole class was the vampire tradition, and so this was just one of many books we read. I mean, we also read some poetry, and we read a play and all that kind of stuff, but this one was just really fun. Another book that I talk a lot about from that class is Carmilla. Absolutely wonderful. It came before Dracula, and it's very short, so if maybe you're interested in Dracula, but maybe you don't want to dive into such a big book, you can read something that came before it, which was Carmilla, which I think is fantastic. So that's that. Okay, another book that I read that I have I'm making it a sentimental choice because I didn't actually love the book, but I wrote one of my favorite papers in grad school on this book, and then I presented that paper in Chicago at a literary conference, and it was just like this like huge moment in my mind of like my graduate career. So anyway, that is Middlemarch. This is a long ass book. This is like 830 pages long, and there are a million characters. It's like a Dickens novel. There are so many characters. Some of the characters have similar names, so it's not a super easy read in my opinion. I think that like if you decide to read it, it can be super fulfilling, and it is really fun in a lot of places, but it's definitely not a book I recommend if you're like just trying to get into like classic literature. So anyway, the paper that I wrote was basically about one of the main characters, Rosamond's neck, and how she uses her neck to win the affection of one of the men in the novel. And so it was a study of necks. I mean, again, it's like an 800-page novel, and I think her neck comes up 9 times. So it was a close reading essay. It was like a 15-page essay, but I presented on it, and it was so much fun. And, you know, it feels sentimental. I have a connection to this book because of the necks. Okay, another book that I read for school. This was for my final exam, and I talked about this because it was one of the best books of 2022 for me, but that is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. This book was fantastic, and it's even in like the first, I think it's like the first 3 paragraphs that just absolutely grip you. I already read this passage in that video, but I'm gonna read it again because of how good I think it is. Prologue, first paragraph. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. That's the first page. That's the prologue. And that sets us up for an incredible conversation and an incredible novel. I mean, what I love so much is that we have a main character who is trying to stay invisible and yet is incredibly tangible to the reader because we are on this story with them, you know? And so you're just watching a main character who is nameless to the reader, but is your only tangible person in the book, right? Like it is that consciousness that you are in the entire time. And so you follow them as they go through so many things, and a lot of them are really terrible, and they're used so much by other people for gain, and they're manipulated, and then they start to figure the game out a little bit, especially towards like the middle and final 3/4. So I just thought this book was fantastic. Again, it was one of my favorite books of 2022, and I'm so glad that it was on my exam list. And again, the audiobook is awesome. So if you've ever been interested in this one, the audiobook is really exceptional. And I just really loved it. All right, another book that I read for grad school. I actually had read it before grad school, but rereading it gave me a whole new appreciation on just like character study, was Their Eyes Were Watching God. This one was incredible. And I think the first time I read it, I loved it. But the second time around, I just remember being so fascinated by Janie, the main character, and how she as a character is so obviously pulled into the cast of other men's lives. I'm not sure if this is making sense, but these men in her life use her for their own gain, use her as a figurehead, use her to make themselves feel better and to get further in their own careers and lives and accomplishments, and never appreciate her and are incredibly intimidated by her and try to squash out her light and her brilliance. There's also this, seriously, one of the best pieces of literature I've ever read. There's like a whole, I wish I had my copy. I cannot find it right now, but there's this whole passage that describes her recognizing her feelings for a man coming to a close, like she falls out of love with someone, but she describes it as something falling away in a cabinet. So she like describes her feelings as a tangible object that are in a cabinet, and it comes falling down when she realizes that she no longer feels that way for that man that she thought she was in love with. And it was like, it's seriously one of my favorite passages I've ever read. I just think the way that she described it was phenomenal. And again, I think it was just, I'd already read it and liked it, but having to reread and think of it more critically and just study like character intentions and character space was really fantastic in this one. All right, next up we have a book that I've talked so much about, so I'll try to keep this one brief, but that is The Maltese Falcon. I wish I could find my copy that's actually annotated. I don't know where it is right now. But this is also an incredible copy. I mean, look at that. That's the Maltese Falcon on the front, my friends. But this is just like a classic hard-boiled detective novel that I read for my first class in graduate school. It was technically a upper division bachelor level class, but it was the first, I had a prerequisite I had to fill, and so I was like, okay, I'll take this like kind of crime, detective fiction kind of class. I don't know what we're gonna read. And we had to read The Maltese Falcon, and it was a blast. It was so fun. I mean, it's not a perfect novel. We have a main character who is like through and through a hard-boiled detective from the 1930s, so he is like super misogynistic, and he is not a good guy. But I just like, if you're just looking for like a, you know, like a classic 30s detective novel, it's like really, to me, it's really fun, and they're trying to find this literal falcon statue that's been painted black so that you don't see how valuable it is, because the way it's described is that it's like a jewel encrusted statue. It's like super expensive, and to hide its identity, people paint it black. And so you're trying to find this falcon statue that is seemingly worth nothing, but the people looking for it know its true value. So anyway, it's super fun. Again, it's not perfect, but for the time and the era, like you really get that kind of like cold, quick, overly descriptive main character who does the hard-boiled thing really well. And there you go. All right, just a couple more books, my friends. Next, we've got North and South. This is both a book that I just really loved structurally and writing-wise, but it's also sentimental because this was the first book that I read at a graduate level. So The Maltese Falcon I read technically in a bachelor level class, like it was just an upper division class, but this was the first book that I read as a graduate student with other grad students, and I was so scared of that class. I was so nervous. I felt so stupid. I felt like I had no right to be in the class, and I was just really overwhelmed because I didn't get my bachelor's degree in literature. So like, I just felt like this was an accident, like they shouldn't have let me into this program. And then we read this book and I really loved it. And I wrote a paper focusing on the time that fruit is mentioned in this novel and how fruit is like a reprieve when the characters are in this like very foggy, cloudy, dusty, dirty London. The fruit is the reprieve that brings them back mentally to the south of England, hence north and south. And I got an A, and it was just this moment of like real validation of like, yes, I still felt like I shouldn't be there, but this helped, like the paper and getting a good grade on that paper helped me feel like I was a little more grounded in the program and that I actually had something valuable to say. And so, yeah, really fun though. There's a BBC miniseries. It's really good. It's just fun. There's like 4 episodes and they're like an hour and a half long, and yeah, I love this one. Okay, the next one is on this list because I'm shocked that I loved it, and that is Paradise Lost by Milton. I had to take a Milton class. Like you had to take a class that was out of your kind of century of study. I mean, I had various centuries I had to study, but you had to like kind of go really far back and take at least one from a very long time ago. And so I was really nervous about Milton. It was like a solely focused Milton class, and I was really overwhelmed, and I was like, I'm not gonna understand anything. I'm going to be super, super out of the loop, and I'm not gonna have anything to say. And first of all, the professor was just fantastic. She was one of my favorite professors in the entire time I was in grad school. So that definitely helped, because when you have someone who's able to like take a subject and make it kind of coherent is really great. But she just made Milton really fun. Like reading Paradise Lost could have been my worst nightmare, and it honestly was. I tried everything to get out of that class, but there was like, you just couldn't graduate without that requirement. And so I was like, like couldn't have at least been a Shakespeare class or something. Like, why Milton? I did not care about Milton. I did not want to read Milton. And then had to take it, read Paradise Lost. I loved it. It was also great because like she's approaching Milton, like she understands that Paradise Lost gets a horrible rap because of the way that Eve is portrayed. But my professor, had a completely different take on how Eve is portrayed. And so she just presented us with alternate thinkings around the literature, which it just really like, I think pushed against how our brains wanted to read certain things. And I don't know, it never felt like she was forcing us to agree with her. She was just like, you might have read this and thought this, but could I maybe offer you a different way to look at it? And I just felt like that was so incredible for my learning, and it made Paradise Lost way more tangible. But it was super fun and really gruesome, and just like the way Satan is written in Paradise Lost is so interesting to read because his character changes so much book to book. So anyway, that's Paradise Lost. Now, let's pivot. We only have 2 more, my friends, but let's pivot to Frankenstein. Now, I read this before grad school, and I liked it. I mean, I thought it was really good, but I was like, okay, like, read that, moving on, and then I had to reread it, and just absolutely fell in love with it the second reading, and I think it's because I reread it after reading Paradise Lost, and there was a lot of tie-in and mentions to Paradise Lost, because we really have, like, Dr. Frankenstein is like God in the way that he creates the monster, just like God created Adam. And so there's a lot of parallels, and it's even something that, like, the monster talks about, because the monster becomes educated and learns to read, and he reads Paradise Lost, and so he quotes it a lot, and it just becomes this anchor in his life that he kind of leans back on a lot, and it's kind of how he explains his own existence. And I loved that, but there's also incredible conversation and allusions to mental health. And I felt like that was a way to read Frankenstein in a way that I didn't the first time. The first time I was just like, oh my God, this isn't like how pop culture makes Frankenstein sound, right? Like the monster is green with these bolts. But in the book, he is so intelligent and he is so lonely and he is desperate for companionship, and he's, you know, he's violent. Like he does do some questionable things, but you know, he's just fascinating to read. And I just really enjoyed getting a different perspective on Frankenstein, because you just see him one way and then you read the book and you're like, holy shit. But then when I reread it, I was like, wow, there's a lot more here that I didn't pick up on the first time. So there you go. All right, the last book on this list is Wuthering Heights. I mentioned this book in my Best Books of 2022 video, and it deserved to be there, and it deserves to be here, because I did not want to read this book. I tried reading it like 8 years ago and hated it. I got like 2 chapters in and was like, I don't care. I don't care. Thank you though. But after rereading it, I had so much fun. I mean, I was forced to read it, so I was like, this is gonna suck, I'm not gonna care, but let me just like try to get through it. And like, I don't know how I didn't get past chapter 2, because I think chapter 2 is when things really get interesting. So I don't know like what Past Noel was doing, because this is a goldmine of deception, regret, remorse, sadness, heartbreak, and revenge. Like, it is a true revenge plot. And you might hear the names like Heathcliff and Catherine a lot. You can read it like it's even referenced in Book Lovers, and so you might hear those names. And so I was expecting this wonderfully beautiful kind of Lizzie and Darcy type of romance, and instead you get a tragic love story that is fueled by anger and regrets and living up to expectations and wanting one thing but knowing you have to make a different decision, and loss and true heartbreak that is not manifested in sadness. It's manifested in pure hateful rage. Anyway, I literally could do an entire video on Wuthering Heights, because I just feel like I have so much to say about it, but I do want to reread it, so maybe I could do like a reading vlog on it. But anyway, those are the books, my friends. Those are some of the books that I read for grad school. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you think of them. If you have any other classics that you recommend, let me know. And just thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. I hope you had fun, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!